Okay, so today I'm going to go over the Re1 variation of the Berlin. So the Berlin defense, obviously, as we've seen in the candidates, starts after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and knight f6 hitting the e4 pawn. Here, where the Re1 variation starts after castles, we allow the black knight to take on e4, and now we immediately win the pawn back with Re1. There's also d4 with the theoretical endgame. There's all of this, takes, there, etc. But there's a lot of theory there, and some people might just prefer this. There's not as much risk involved in the Re1 variation because it's very symmetrical, although white can definitely try for some advantages here. Black's kind of forced to go back to knight d6, hitting the bishop, because otherwise, like after d3, d5, trying to defend the knight, they're just going to get hit, and now this pawn's not defending the knight, so there's also some issues with this pin. So yeah, knight d6 is kind of forced, and then here, white can just move the bishop back and then win this pawn later, although I'm not sure I'm a fan of allowing f6, which might be a little bit tough for white to deal with. I think it makes more sense to just take immediately and then go for bishop f1. Black can't take your bishop, obviously, because of this discovery, so they can either take or play bishop e7 to try to block the file. If they take, it just transposes into a line we're going to cover right after this one, so we'll look at that later. After bishop e7, it's the same thing. Bishop e7, and here we're going to go for bishop f1. It looks like a kind of weird move to play bishop f1, although if we consider other options, we could take and give up the bishop pair, which also opens up their bishop, and also the knight, which was misplaced because it was blocking the bishop's development, is now perfectly fine on d6. So we don't really want to do that, and we could also take there, but it's the same issue, and now our bishop has to go back the same way to f1. So we start with, there's also bishop d3 potentially, but now we're just blocking the d pawn, and our bishop doesn't really want to develop this way to b2. Would prefer to just develop to f4 naturally. So bishop f1. Now here there are two options. Black can just take on e5 and then continue playing, which we're going to look at after, or they could play knight f5. Now knight f5 objectively is not as good as knight takes e5. It's not preferred, although it definitely is fine for black. The reason why knight f5 isn't so popular anymore is because, well, the idea is basically to keep more pieces on the board and avoid immediate trades, and maybe give black some winning chances, though after knight f3, now we're going back because they didn't want to take the trade, this knight's not great. It probably was better to just give it up and exchange it. Now this knight's very well placed, and this one's blocking the c pawn, which might want to defend the center in the future, and we'll see after like d5, d4, or castles, d4, d5. This knight's definitely a little bit misplaced. Black's going to need to spend time improving it, and this knight's also could be better. I might prefer to have it on like f6 or d6 as well. White might continue with something like c3 to defend the d pawn, so that after that we can develop without hanging the d4 pawn, and after bishop d6, giving the knight a square to move to, bishop d3, rook e1, taking the center with the rook. Here we could just develop the queen and whatnot, or continue playing, but we don't personally really want the queen to go here because eventually they're going to get a rook there, and then it's going to attack our queen with tempo. So we're going to take their rook instead, and now when we continue developing with something like this, white might continue with something like queen b3 or queen c2 and rook e1, and we get the open file. Black's knight's still misplaced. Our knight's gonna move to g3 or e3 eventually, and it's definitely equal, though white can try to play for something as well. It's not super pleasant for black. Like something like knight e7, queen b3, c6, not c6 because that hangs the pawn. There are some issues here. I don't know if you really even want to go for rook b8. Right. It's definitely not entirely comfortable. So generally we're gonna look at knight takes e5 instead, where black just gets rid of the misplaced knight, and after castles there are two options. We can either just take the center normally or knight c3. Now, the point of knight c3 is simply to win the bishop on e7. If black does nothing, let's say they go here, there's no way they're going to avoid this. They could try, they could try going here, but probably, the bishop's not well placed there. It's probably going to get attacked. Actually, there's just this. So, yeah, you're gonna lose the bishop. So what black can try to just attack the, if black tries to go for the attack and just win a tempo on the rook, then still they can't really avoid losing the bishop. Now, since after like rook e1, take the file, there's no way to really move the bishop. I mean, maybe you could go for like g6 to stop it, although, I mean, now we're kind of getting some sort of initiative with extra development. I'm not sure that you really wanted this bishop here, and black's development's a lot slower. Either way, they're going to be losing time if they want to try to save the bishop. Yeah, here we just win the bishop like that, and this sort of endgame is slightly pleasant for white with a bishop pair. White might go for something like queen b4. Let's say rook here. I mean, probably something like queen here. Trades, and yeah, the bishops have nice targets over on the queen side. The pawn structure is symmetrical, although it's not entirely great. I think the database scores are pretty nice for white. So usually we get something instead of bishop f6, like knight e8. The point being that we're going to give the bishop a square on d6 to escape knight d5. We still play knight d5 anyway, but after knight d6, rook here, they hit the bishop, or they hit the knight. Now we're just going to go back, and now we're going to play for knight f5 and still try to win the bishop. After bishop c7, knight f5, and d5, they can't really avoid losing this bishop either. The main difference, though, is black. The position isn't as simplified. They haven't traded a rook and whatnot, and the pawns on the queen side seem a lot more solid than they did in the other variation. Kramnik in comments over this position said he didn't really mind it. He thought that was probably the best way to approach the line for black, and it's not really much for white. After like d3, there's just f5, and the space on the king side is actually kind of annoying for white. I'm not sure that I like this variation so much. It's alright, but it's definitely not one-sided. There's also bishop e7 to try to avoid losing the bishop pair. Now, after just knight f5, they would just go to f6, right? The issue here for black might be just, it is kind of just c4, and then after knight c7 to try to expand in the center and develop the bishop. d4, d5, takes. Black throws in this intermezzo, because after knight takes, if you take with queen, then this bishop is hanging, and we kind of don't want to both isolate the pawns, right? So after bishop d2, we have to throw this in, takes, knight takes, takes, and rook e5. The d4 pawn is isolated, sure, but in exchange, white gets an open e file. I mean, we're gonna start with bishop c4 because we want to avoid the bishop coming here. If bishop there, then we just isolate that pawn. We get the open file, bishop d7 to develop, and rook e1. And you can see this position's kind of pleasant for white. We have the nice free file and whatnot. It's definitely equal, though it's not entirely fun. Again, a lot of bishop f4 is kind of playing for these endgames that are slightly pleasant for white. You're usually not playing for a great advantage immediately. Let's say like rook a8. You could go for like queen c3 or queen e3, and we're still getting a lot of space. They're not, black pieces are like slightly less active. Definitely better for white a little bit, although the engines would draw it without much trouble, right? Okay, so the last variation we're going to look over is d4 here. After knight c3, it's very unprincipled to just go for like all these knight moves and try to win the bishop pair. Obviously, it's fine, but definitely not what most people go for. d4 just seems more natural, taking space in the center. And then here there's two main lines. There's bishop f6, just developing the bishop with tempo, and knight e8, trying to play d5 immediately. After knight e8, there's an important idea to remember, just d5. Here the bishop can't really go to f6 because, well, the rook's hemmed in and our development's going to be a bit slow. Let's say after all of this, maybe black can go for like g6, knight here, trading off the bishop, but immediately we just have the rook, the open e-file, and it doesn't seem so pleasant for black. So probably what most people go for is bishop c5. Just seems like a pretty nice square for the bishop. Rook e1, getting out of d6 with tempo, d6. And here, it's not so much for white, but definitely it's a little bit. It's not super comfortable. The database scores are perfectly fine. It's like probably like 85% draws or something. But it's a little bit nicer for white because of the extra space. In general, most people would just go for bishop f6. It's a very natural move. I think that's what you'll see most of the time. And then here, rook e8. After knight e8, now you kind of walk into this d5 variation, but the bishop's on a worse square, really. It's not as good. Rook e8, and now here, after trades, sure, you can argue that this bishop's misplaced, but now we don't have a piece holding the e-file, and the rook, they traded off a pair of rooks. It makes the position a lot simpler. So generally, white doesn't trade, that we let them take us, and there's an option of like c3, or what I'm going to recommend is bishop f4. Now c3, after like rook takes, they trade, and they go knight a8. We don't really have an option to play. I mean, after bishop f4, d5, this is kind of like the main way, GM way to play the position. We've developed, but they kind of just immediately trade everything off. They go for like c6 or something, and this variation is really hard to play for a win. At the end of the day, rook e1, it's not super challenging. If black knows all of this theory, it's just gonna be equal. They can probably just trade all the pieces down the e-file, but it's important to remember this sort of thing with black if you're playing black, because otherwise your position's probably not going to be so fun. Like if you go for there's a million other ways to try to develop, but this is really the best way to equalize in the bishop f4 classical line. Now instead you have the option of, instead of c3, you have bishop f5, f4, and then after they trade, here it looks like we've gambited a pawn, and we have, but after we doubled their pawns, you go for like knight c3. The pressure down the d-file is already pretty poor for black. We're probably just going to win the pawn back immediately, and then this pawn's going to be isolated. They just get a really bad IQP, which we're probably going to win eventually. It's just a lot of, it's probably still equal, but it's a lot of black defending. It's not so fun. So generally, black players would just go for knight e8, and after c3, we just transpose into that variation I talked about. Instead, we have the option of knight c3 if you really want to avoid that kind of symmetrical draw. Here, we're just giving up the d4 pawn. In exchange, we're just going to activate all of our pieces and kick around the bishop. We're even willing to give up this b pawn. Usually, black just develops with d6, kind of defends any threats over there. Bishop g5. The point of bishop g5, E1 knight's going to hang, so they kind of have to end up with F6. And now here, the knight's even is going to have a hard time developing. We're willing to give up these pawns in exchange for all this nice piece development. We might line up the bishop with the king. There's definitely some sort of attack here, and if you want to study this on your own, there are a few. This was kind of a trendy line for a little while, although it's kind of worked out to be a forced draw if black knows everything. Although in your games, it's definitely not just going to be an immediate draw. I don't think very many black players actually know this. My coach said he hadn't seen this at all actually, so it's definitely something to look at if you want some more imbalance in your games rather than just that symmetrical draw. Although it's definitely a lot more risky. You're going to have to study this on your own if you want all the lines. If you just want the really safe option, then obviously c3 is what you want to go for. And yeah, that's really all I have for the video. I tried to go overview both sides of the Rook E1 variation, so you know how to play it with black, how to play it with white, and yeah, anything else you might have to study on your own. But yeah, I tried my best here. Thank you guys for watching, and I'm gonna end it here.